Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement here at long last with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about the presidential election in the United States through the lens of A Course in Miracles. Before we get into that, though, we should acknowledge that this is your first podcast recording in quite a long time. Robert, you've been out with a fairly serious case of what we believe is post-viral fatigue. But I'm happy to report that even though you're not entirely out of the woods, you are feeling much better these days, thanks in large part, we know, to all the many prayers that you've received.
It's been wonderful to be on the receiving end of prayers and healing, and it's nice to be missed. And it's great to be feeling better. I hope to be feeling absolutely on the other side of this within, you know, not too long from now.
Well, you were definitely missed, and I'm so glad that you are back in the saddle for so many reasons. But I'm also very grateful to have you back to be part of this conversation about an issue that is very much on our minds, and that is, again, the presidential election here in the United States. Lately, when we've been doing classes and whatnot and opening it up for discussion, the election is the first thing that people want to talk about. And that's understandable because there is so much at stake. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how would the course have us hold this? There's obviously a lot that can be said in response to that, but in an effort to keep things simple, Robert and I have been talking about this idea, and we've narrowed our discussion today down to three main takeaways. So we can hold this election by seeking to, number one, forgive and love the other side, as the Course would say, seeing a world without enemies. Number two, not trying to be above or disengage from a process that affects so many people. So understanding that your vote does indeed matter. And three, recognizing that you don't have to be at the mercy of the results. So in other words, no matter what happens from a spiritual place, we can remain unshaken. And Robert, I don't know if you want me to just go right into the first point or if you want to say anything about these three points collectively.
I would say let's dive in.
Okay, all right. So the first idea we want to talk about is forgive and love the other side. And this is obviously what the Course would say. Forgiveness is at the heart of the Course's thought system. It's the Course's central teaching. And yet, forgiveness is incredibly tough, or we would be so much better at it. And the alarming thing about the moment that we're living in right now is that we used to have a society where, number one, we had a shared set of facts, but where you also had candidates in elections where if that candidate held a different vision for where the country should go, it didn't really matter as much as it seems to matter now, because we didn't tend to view the other candidate as a threat and a danger. And this is the thing that concerns me the most about this time, because it's very easy for Western countries to look at the systems and the institutions that we've gotten right, whether it's free press or courts or checks and balances in government, and say, well, we've got it figured out. What's wrong with these other countries where citizens are suffering because they just can't get along? And then you look at what's happening here now and you realize, oh, wait, people are people wherever you go. No one's immune from the destructive nature of the ego. And so, really, what I'm getting at is, as the systems that uphold our order are becoming more and more fragile, it's left to us as people to hold a set of communal values while working to repair the systems. And this is where spirituality and ethics come in, because it's those values that can be the higher wisdom that guides us all. and everyone's looking around saying, what is ours to do right now? And that's what I believe is ours to do right now, is to hold the line of the spiritual and ethical values that can carry us through, particularly this value of not making enemies and forgiving the other side.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of ways to diagnose what's wrong with our country, but one of them is this: we are a country torn apart by grievances. It's not that hard to see. And I think you look at certain places in the world and you think, these are such old grievances and they keep perpetuating from one generation to the next. And that's what's tearing them apart. But that's what's going on here too, I think. And so, what's the solution to that? Well, from the Course in Miracles standpoint, the solution is not satisfying the grievances, it's letting them go. The solution is forgiveness. And that is our path. We ideally should be the experts in forgiveness. I really think that if enough people could just forgive the other side, the conflict would be over. And then we could sort out what to do, right? But when the questions of what to do bear so much weight of grievance, then you can never sort them out. And I think that sufficient number of people forgiving is not going to happen anytime soon, but it's got to start somewhere. We, as people studying a path of forgiveness, can do our part in getting it started.
I love the idea that as course students, with forgiveness as the heart of this path, we should be masters of forgiveness. We should be holding up a standard of forgiveness that others look to and say, wow, what are they doing? And I'll even go a little further than that, because it's not even just about the course. Every push we've ever had towards making this nation a more perfect union has sprung from faith traditions. So, whether you're talking about the abolition of slavery or the women's right to vote or civil rights, you look at the roots of those groups and you find people motivated by a core belief of some version of Imago Dei, that everyone is created in the image of God, therefore everyone is equal and should be free. So we've got that as a starting point, and there is a level of forgiveness that's baked into that idea, right? We're all like God, and so even though we make mistakes, we can forgive each other. But we should have that value of seeing invisible divine reality in each other. That's the basis on which we forgive. And if enough of us had that in the collective, we would be able to move through these times.
We often say the very core of the Course is seeing the divinity, seeing the Son of God in everyone. So we talk about that a lot. What I'd like to focus on right now is a certain aspect of that. There are a lot of aspects of that, but one aspect is seeing sameness. We need to look at the other side and, of course, see them as sons of God. That's everything. But part of seeing them that way is seeing them as the same as us. And that means overlooking differences. There is a quote in the Course that says, healing is the way to undo the belief in differences. Lesson 262 is, let me perceive no differences today. And that means differences between people. I think we know that when we see them as the other, as stranger, as alien, as totally unlike us, what comes along with that is a lot of suspicion and fear, and what comes along with it is hate. So, from the Course's standpoint, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that's what I'm trying to get at in pointing out that so much of progressive societal reform has come as a result of spiritual beliefs And I like how you phrase that, spiritual beliefs related to sameness, that because we are all created in the image of God, because the Course would use the language, we're all sons of God, we all deserve to be treated equally, we all deserve to be free.
Right.
And so the
And
root of the movement comes from spiritual values.
well, it absolutely does for us. From the course's standpoint, we are exactly the same on that higher level. But even on the human level, we need to realize how much sameness is there. So even on the level of this world, the people on the other side carry the same light in them that we carry in us. They also carry the same darkness in their hearts that we have in ours. I think it helps to realize that, like us, they are struggling inside themselves to keep that darkness at bay, just like we are all the time. And they, like us, are too often losing that battle. So I think we need to see that sameness and also realize that we've got to face the darkness in our own hearts and our own minds. There's a really great passage about this in the course that I want to go ahead and read. It says, this is from chapter 13, and only if you are would you choose to bring this darkness with you, and by holding it in your mind, see it as a dark cloud that shrouds your brothers and conceals their reality from your sight. This darkness is in you, it says. So he's talking about projection here. How is the darkness in us manifest? It's manifest in how we see the other side. The darkness we see in them isn't real in them. It's the dark shroud from within us that we have thrown over them. So, how we see the other side, however much they seem to be awful and terrible and destructive, how we see them is our contribution to the darkness in the world or to the light in the world. And obviously, letting go of that dark cloud, that dark shroud that we put over them is forgiveness. We need to forgive the people on the other side. They are our neighbors, they're our family, they're our friends. So often it's almost overwhelmingly tempting to distance ourselves from them, to cut them out of our heart, to cut them out of our life. We just feel too different, right? But I would say don't do that, right? Don't identify them with their political beliefs. Just identify with them, see their sameness with you. I think that if enough of us could do that, to see the sameness, to identify with them, we'd have a different country and we'd be able to stop taking the darkness in us and just spreading it in the world.
Yeah, and the Course is so powerful at pointing out that this destructiveness, the ego, is in all of us. I remember covering a text section not too long ago in class called The Last Unanswered Question. And in that section, it's talking about how we're all going through the world looking for enemies. And what we like to do is we like to say, well, the problem is over there. The problem is with the other side. They're the ones who are filled with hate. They're the ones who are making enemies. And to your point on projection, that doesn't really let us off the hook for what's really going on, which is there's a desire in us to see enemies too. And so as long as both sides are in this place of seeing the other as enemy, we're always going to be in this state of perpetual conflict and friction. And so that's the thing to look at. And I'm not trying to paint a false equivalency here. I actually think that there's real danger in the world right now, and we'll get to that in our next point. but just in terms of how we can view one another, just because someone has a different ideological view than you, that doesn't mean that you cut them out of your life. And that's one of the more tragic parts of this time in which we live. So many friendships have broken up, so many families have been torn apart. And if we are going to be in the business of repair, which is what we're supposed to do as spiritual seekers and spiritual students, we're in the business of healing, then we need to not be making enemies. We need to be about the work of healing that. And the only way that you can heal it is if you are engaged in the process. And that's where we go wrong. We take someone's harmful, what we perceive to be harmful ideology, and we scorn and judge them for it. And as I keep saying, scorn and judgment is not the starting point from which to companion someone out of a harmful ideology. You have to get in there with them in a way that is respectful and is seeing them as beloved and belonging with them, and then we companion each other home. But as long as we're withdrawing, hating, blaming, cursing each other, we're never going to get there. And I understand how hard that is, because it takes a certain amount of patience and a certain amount of spiritual sight to companion someone out of a harmful ideology. But that's what's required of the moment in which we live. That's who
Yeah.
we need to develop ourselves to be as
Yeah.
spiritual students in this time.
I have a longtime friend who took a very public stance on COVID that was different from mine. And yeah, I found it disturbing. I was tempted to back away. And I finally wrote him and I said, look, the relationship is what matters. I'm on a different side here. Um, but the relationship's more important. And then he shared that he had been um, ostracized by so many people, even people in his family, for the stance he took. And clearly he was in a lot of pain about that. Doesn't that matter more than our political opinions?
Love is the starting point for these conversations. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the course is it's one of the practices in the course is learning how to love even when you view yourself as under attack. And that takes real spiritual strength. And so to say to someone, I actually your ideology as harmful to me and people I care about and to society at large, frankly, but I'm going to love you anyway. That's big. And
I think that's
that's what we're
big.
not seeing right now.
And I think the more we front load that first part, like the longer we go on about how harmful we think they're being, probably the less of the message of love they're gonna get.
Receiving.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. One
Yeah,
thing, and I know we have to move on to our next
yeah.
point, but I've been talking about this a lot in podcasts, the most recent podcasts on peacemaking with Jared Swigart and Oshita Moore of Global Immersion. And this isn't in the course, but one of the things that they're saying that I really agree with is if you can stop trying to argue on ideology and get into people's stories, then you can find some common ground. So as if you're curious about where someone's coming from and why they believe what they believe, that is a starting point from which to enter these conversations and keep the relationship together while you seek to, move along to a higher place together.
And I think also just, relate to them as people.
Yeah.
When we aren't talking about politics, I think the fact that we have so much in common becomes more apparent.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the first point, loving and forgiving what we perceive as the other side, not looking out at the world and seeing enemies. The second point is not trying to be above this political process and to understand that our engagement, and particularly right now, our vote matters. We've been talking about letting go of our resentments towards the quote unquote other side. And particularly in spiritual spaces, what we hear as a way to avoid that resentment is, well, the trick is not to have a side, right? So we just don't get involved at all. And it's very popular in spiritual circles to say, well, I don't read the news or I don't vote because both sides are equally rotten to the core. And therefore, the holy position is to be above the battleground. And that's why the second point we want to make here is not to withdraw from this process or claim to be above it. The idea is to get in there and transform it with love. And this is where we have to engage. This is where we believe we have to vote because your vote matters. The Course doesn't speak directly to voting, but Jesus does paint a deeply humanitarian vision in the Course where spiritual principles are meant to widen our circles of caring, not to shrink them. And he wants us to be active in that caring. So, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. I think it's really tempting with the spiritual path that teaches that the world is an illusion, which the Course very openly and centrally does, to think we shouldn't care kind of beyond ourselves, right? Because it's all illusory. Um, but the Course is really clear that we are not here to just find our own salvation. We're here for everyone's salvation. There's a line in the workbook that says our true purpose is to save the world. There's a line in the clarification of terms that says God's voice asks of everyone one question only: are you ready yet to help me save the world? And so, even though it's tempting to think we should opt out of collective issues, they'll take care of themselves, we take care of our own life and our own spiritual journey, the Course actually says that making decisions for ourselves alone is the wrong concept of decision. And it says that the teachers of God, quote, choose for all mankind, for all the world, and all things in it. We should be consciously making choices that we believe benefit everyone. And that's voting, right? And to just underline the urgency and importance of this, there's that famous celestial speed up guidance that came right as the Course was beginning to come through, right? It was about to begin to come through. And what it said is an explanation for why the Course was starting to come through Helen Schuckman. It said that the Course came because the world situation was worsening at an alarming rate, that more people were going backward than going forward. And as a result, the plan was speeding up. And the form that took was that certain people, like Helen and Bill, were being called into this world, called into incarnation, you could say, to take up their part in the plan. So if heaven speeds up its plan in response to crisis on earth, if people are born because they can help in the crisis, and otherwise they'd be kicking back for a while and not having a life on earth. If that's what heaven's plan does, we shouldn't consider ourselves like above it all, above caring, above pitching in to help. Maybe like Helen and Bill, we have come into incarnation for the purpose of helping.
One of the ideas on this topic that is so inspiring to me is the Holy Spirit comes in and doesn't take away the things of this world. He comes in and he transforms them. So the Holy Spirit doesn't take away your special relationships, for example. He wants to transform them from special to holy. He doesn't take away your quote unquote special function that you've used in service of the ego. He gives you your special function in service of healing. He doesn't take away the skills that you have acquired, the Course says, to excel. He uses those same skills to equalize. And so here's this idea that we don't withdraw from the world, we get in there and transform it with a new set of skills and a new vision of what all of this is for. And so I really think that the celestial speed up guidance is so important for us to keep in mind as course students, because when Helen is saying, well, why did the course come now? And Jesus is saying, because humanity is going backwards and losing more than it's gaining. Well, we can listen to that and say, oh, all the more reason to just do nothing. Or we can listen to that and say, all the more reason to get in there because what we do matters. And
And
so, yeah, go ahead.
and speaking of the whole thing of using your skills and abilities, Helen was told she wasn't really ready to use this ability through which she would bring in the course. The ability to be a channel. She wasn't ready to use it again yet, which is why she was so conflicted about it. But she was called in to use it because of the what was called the acute emergency. So it's kind of like you might be an off duty, you might be in the military in the reserves and called into active duty because there's a situation that requires you. Maybe you aren't ready to use your abilities really yet, but maybe you're called to do that.
And that idea can stretch us to a new place. So I'm thinking, for example, of here at the circle, we've got Sarah who's taken over the text classes. And when I said, Robert's not doing well, he's not feeling well, can you lead the text classes? And she was like, but then you put someone in a role and they rise to it. And that's this feels like the moment where everything in the world that's burning is asking us to rise to a new level. Like, if I didn't take love seriously before, I better take it seriously now. If I didn't take forgiveness seriously before, I better take it seriously now. And even though I might not feel ready to do that, the time is calling me to lift up
Yeah.
and be
Yeah.
someone better than I was before. And I think that's the call for all of us. We're all here using skills that we didn't feel ready for, and we have to, because that's what's needed.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's very common to hear vote your values in elections, and this is a Course in Miracles podcast. So, what would you say to course students? How do we vote our values? What would you say are its values?
I don't think this is too hard. I mean, we know the core stands for love, not hate. We know it stands for forgiveness, not grievance. We know it stands for the inestimable worth of each person, regardless of their religion, their race, their ethnicity, their level of wealth, whatever. We know the course is about unity and not division. I mean, the separation was what started this mess. We know it's about peace, not war. We did podcasts, you and I, a few years ago on just what a strong position that course takes against war, all throughout. We know, as you said earlier, that it wants us to see a world without enemies, and it wants us to have a goal of a world without enemies. Now, let's face it, neither major candidate stands fully for the course's values. I don't see how they would be a major candidate if they did, right? Because the world's not there yet. But the question is, who is the closest? Whose vision gets us to that endpoint of a world without enemies faster? So if we're going to vote our values, I think those are the kinds of things we need to ask ourselves.
And that's an important point about whose vision gets you closer. Because part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is because of that pervasive idea of, well, it's all just broken, so I'm going to sit this out. And even though the system isn't perfect, people aren't perfect, there is a choice between vision here. And what is the vision that's going to get us closer to a society where everyone is free and equal, and a vision that is much, much darker? And there's a part of the course in chapter 7 of the text of the CE. This is new material in the complete and annotated edition about the four freedoms that Franklin D. Roosevelt put forth in his 1941 State of the Union address. And I'll read this part. It said the course says, you have probably heard many arguments on behalf of quote unquote the freedoms, which would indeed have been freedom if men had not chosen to fight for them. And then the quote goes on to say that freedoms should not be fought for, but should be sided with. And so it's a remarkable thing that the course is speaking in favor of these four freedoms of the FDR. So can you explain what they are and why you think Jesus cares about them?
Yes. First of all, I think he's absolutely talking about the four freedoms. He calls them the freedoms, but the four freedoms are often called the freedoms. He expects that we've heard arguments in support of them. So there's something that are present in the culture. He says men shouldn't have gone to fight for them. They were part of the pretext for the US going into war, or at least for FDR urging us to support the Allies in World War II. Okay, so what are the four freedoms? The idea, according to Roosevelt, was that they are fundamental rights everyone has. Everyone deserves these. Number one, freedom of speech. Number two, freedom of worship. Number three, freedom from want. And number four, freedom from fear. And that really means fear of war. And you could also include violence. So the first two are freedom of speech and worship. The last two are freedom from want and from fear. And I think freedom of speech and worship, that sounds very familiar. It sounds very American. But freedom from want, that is really extreme. And I want to look just for a second at that one and talk about it. FDR really meant that for freedom of speech was a big deal in his mind and for his agenda. And so, in the wake of that, 3 years later, at another State of the Union address, he proposed the Economic Bill of Rights, and he died before it could be enacted. But he argued for fundamental rights to employment, adequate income, housing, education, and medical care in the 40s. And then we could go into freedom from fear, also radical. But these freedoms clearly are a deeply humanitarian vision. They're about promoting the welfare of everyone without exception. They've got a very storied history. They shaped post-war policies, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the United Nations. They helped shape the foundation of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and they're still around as a powerful influence on global human rights advocacy. They challenge inequality, oppression, poverty all over the world. And so it's really interesting that Jesus clearly approves of their essence, but he says that we shouldn't have gone to fight for them. So, and I wrestle with that. Like, I don't understand how our world would have been if the US hadn't gone into World War II. Hey, what we can say is that Jesus's vision is even more humanitarian than FDR's. It's the four freedoms plus freedom from war, even freedom from going to war to fight for the four freedoms. So the question is, once again, which candidate is at least closer to this humanitarian vision? I think we can take a stand, and we need to take stands in the world. Um, but our stand, we can take a stand on love. It can be the basis of who we vote for. It can be the basis of any activism we take up or of anything we do to make this a better world. I think that, what you and I have seen so pervasively is this kind of a badge of spirituality to be above it, to say, it's all illusion, I don't care. I think we need, as course students, to flip that. So it's a badge of spirituality to care. and to take sides when we need to, but always take them out of love and make love the side we stand on.
I love that idea that Jesus talks about so much and demonstrates so much in the teaching of the Course, that it's not that you fight against, you side with. And so you'll see this in Course language where he says, I'm not going to attack your ego. I'm just going to try and reason you out of it. And we can take that approach in the way in which we deal with these times. We don't have to attack positions. We don't have to attack people. We can side with positions that are more in alignment with the kind of world that we want to bring forth, which is a world that sides with love. And I really feel like it was a high mark in world human history when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created. And you see that in the United Nations. And that was based in part on this idea of the four freedoms,
I think
where
in large part,
people are entitled to a level of freedom, freedom from and freedom to. And and again, there's no candidate who's perfect, but we really should be siding with candidates and a process that brings us closer to this world that sides with love versus candidates in the process who side with division.
yeah,
Yeah.
and hate
Okay.
and fear.
Hate and fear. And speaking of fear, there is so much to fear about this election. I got a text from a friend of mine in England who basically said, you know, what is wrong with your country right now? I'm looking at all of this polarization and I feel, he said, powerless and afraid. And I think that really sums up how so many of us feel right now. We feel powerless and we feel afraid. But this is also where having a set of spiritual tools and a spiritual perspective can be really helpful, because this is getting us to the third point, because you realize that even though we can feel individually powerless, we know that there's a power at work that's greater than what our eyes can see. And that's our final point, that regardless of what happens in this election, the Course says we don't have to be spiritually at the mercy of the result. And so let's talk about that idea.
Yeah, I find myself like almost not wanting to be around, on election day. I've already voted. Um, you just wonder. I think we're all wondering, what's going to happen to the country. So many of us watch the polls. We are on the edge of our seats as certain influential pundits make their predictions, right?
And it
And what
also feels that no matter who wins, the repair work is just beginning,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. And we can talk more about that. But I think that the way a lot of us feel, and I'm sure voters on absolutely both sides feel this way. It's like that moment when you're on a roller coaster and you just like clicked up to the very top and you're about to take that plunge. Um, and I think we not only feel that way, but it feels like we're on a rickety roller coaster. And as we take the plunge, it could all fall apart. Um, so, what comes to my mind about this is this great passage that you and I talk about all the time in chapter 2 of the CE, where he says that he talks about us being only able to feel free of imprisonment and tyranny. He uses the word tyranny when external conditions are peaceful. Then he says this is not safe because external conditions are produced by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure in heart as yet. So external conditions are produced by thoughts of people all over, people who don't have pure hearts, which means they're not going to be peaceful very often.
And that's everybody, by the way, because nobody has a perfectly pure heart. we're
Right.
all this mixed bag of beauty and ego. And that's what we see reflected in the world around us. That's what we see in our external conditions.
Yeah.
I spoke about this idea recently in a Sunday Gathering podcast about how does God allow suffering? Why does God allow suffering? And it's this whole concept of external conditions are not produced by a God who allows suffering. The Course says external conditions are produced by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure of heart as yet. And so it's almost like a unconscious vote. You know, the collective on some unconscious level is voting for these external conditions that we see around us and that we are all to some degree subject to on the level of form. And so the majority wins, right? The thoughts that we have that we see externally come from a majority mindset that's fear-based, and that's why we're all living in the world that we're in. You see a lot of reflection of purity of heart. There's some very beautiful things that happen in this world. And you see a lot of reflections of impurity in the human heart. And one thing that I was talking about in that Sunday gathering is this concept of external conditions caused by our thoughts lets God off the hook, and I think he needs that. But also, we need that because now we can take some responsibility for what's going on in our own mind and in our own heart. So we can recognize that, okay, if I want external conditions to improve, I've got to heal the impurity of my own heart. And if enough of us do that, then external conditions will change.
That's true. And I think we also have to realize if it's a collective unconscious vote, doesn't mean everyone voted for Hurricane Helene. It doesn't mean everyone voted for some war or some famine, right? Maybe you didn't vote for Hurricane Helene. Who knows? We don't know. Um, but the point is that because it's a collective result, the majority wins, and then we all live through it. And so it can seem like we are at the effect of the majority of the voters,
But then that
right?
quote goes on to say, so external conditions are produced by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure of heart as yet. And then the next line that we almost never quote is, why should you be at their mercy? And I think that's the real heart of this
Yeah,
final point. Why should you
yeah,
be at their mercy? So say
right.
more about that piece.
One thing I like is he even emphasizes there. So he's saying, external conditions are produced by the thoughts of many, not all of whom are pure in heart as yet, suggesting that those impure hearts are voting for tumultuous outcomes, external conditions. Then he says, why should you be at their mercy? And so, why should we be at the mercy of all those voters with impure hearts? That's exactly what we're afraid of for election. And it's a great question. He then goes on to say, really important paragraph in the course, I think, you are perfectly unaffected by all expressions of lack of love. He's talking about those external conditions. These can be, and now he makes it more personal, these can be either from yourself and others, or from yourself to others, or from others to you. Peace is an attribute in you. You cannot find it outside. In a world that seems to have little peace on the outside, we can still be at peace. Why? Because peace is an attribute in us. And the Course says in many places, especially in part two of the workbook, that peace was placed in us by God at our creation because as part of our eternal creation, nothing can take it from us. One of my favorite prayers in the workbook is in lesson 273. It says, Father, your peace is mine. What need have I to fear that anything can rob me of what you would have me keep? So nothing can rob us of the peace God gave us if we're in touch with it. It is perfectly unaffected by all the tumult in the world, by the hurricanes, by the election results we don't like, by the wars. We can be perfectly unaffected by all of it, by all expressions of lack of love. So even if those impure hearts, let's just say it as a possibility, vote into office a candidate that either we think is a disaster or is an actual disaster, we can be perfectly unaffected because nothing can take from us the peace God gave us. And I'm kind of hanging on to that these days,
For
because
dear life.
I have been in fear about the election result, and this is comforting.
What I love about all of these ideas that we've been talking about in this podcast put together is if you can take them as a whole and not plant yourself too much on one side of any of them, then you do have a spiritual way through. And what I mean by that is you can take this last idea of nothing outside of God can have the ability to affect you in any way, can shake your peace in any way. And so often we've seen that very thing be used as an excuse to withdraw from the world. So you can plant yourself too heavily on that side, which causes you to disengage. But then if you're too much in the world, if you're too much like everything we do here matters and matters intensely, then you can be the angry peacemaker, right? And so you don't want to plant yourself too much there. And so there's a way to hold all of these in balance where you are not looking out at the world and seeing enemies. You are seeing harmful ideologies, as I keep saying, and trying to get in there with people to understand the root of these ideologies and companion each other out. And we're also understanding that we have a responsibility to engage and not disengage from a process that affects so many, you know,
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
happens, politics is about our communal life. And that means that poor politics means people suffer and we should care. We work in the field of love. We should care if people suffer. There's nothing spiritual about looking away when someone is suffering.
yeah.
And yet, there's a way in which we can hold all of this by understanding that God is the ultimate safety net and that we can be unshaken by the events of the world because we know that there's a power far greater than those events at work here. And so when you take all of that together, it can give us a way to hold this time and move through it, upholding our spiritual values.
I think it really does. And I think that sometimes in terms of companioning them out, I think that's a great situation if the option's open to you. But one of the things I've learned is that I've tried too long and too hard to reason people out of positions that they weren't going to get out of. And sometimes, I mean, love doesn't say, I'm going to just keep pressuring you and pressing on you with reason until you finally cave. Love doesn't say that. So, so often these people are family, they're neighbors. You can tell by the signs on their lawn, right? Sometimes they're friends. And they're not saying, hey, let's get into this and, have a conversation. Sometimes it's our job just to stay good neighbors and stay loving family members and attentive friends. So I think whatever the situation calls for, love can find a way to express itself.
That's a good point. You're never going to companion someone out of an ideology if they don't want to go with you, right?
Right.
And and that's where I think that getting in there with people's stories, with curiosity about where it is that they're coming from, is a form of love that can be really beneficial in this time. So rather than judging and scorning someone for a view that is the opposite of your own or that you view as harmful, you can just get in there and start talking, start being curious as to why they hold that view. And then to the point of what I was saying earlier, it requires us to, well, it requires everyone to be willing to stay in those hard conversations, to stay in the conversation when we feel like the view is dangerous, because it's the staying in that will get us through. And we're not so good at that. We just want to withdraw immediately.
We just want to withdraw. Yeah. And if we can't argue them out of it, we want to just back away.
Right.
And why? I mean, if they don't want to be argued out of it, I would say don't try, just love them. Because who wants to lose a family member from your life? One more thing, if I can add something, um, I didn't want to try to add this to our series of points to make it a fourth point. But while I was praying about this today, one thing that came to my mind, and it felt right. I don't know if it was real guidance or not. Wasn't quite as strong as to make me certain of that. But what came to mind is there is always a plan. God always has a plan for everything on this earth. And if the majority votes for an outcome that is bad for the country, there's still a plan. And I think God's plans are very, very long range. They can encompass bad choices, they can encompass disastrous outcomes, they can encompass things going astray for a short time or for a long time. They can encompass things going astray. I mean, Helen was talked about by Jesus as having an interval of darkness that seems to have lasted centuries in her soul's trajectory. So I think we just hang on to the fact that even though we can keep our peace in the face of a storm, there is still a plan that God has for that storm and for its resolution.
And in the end, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, as Gandhi famously said, be the change that we want to see in the world. And so if we are looking around and saying, why is everybody so hateful and judgmental? Well, we're being hateful and judgmental as we say it that way.
I
And so,
know.
one thing I have tremendous respect for the civil rights movement, as everyone no doubt knows. And one of the things that I love about it is that the goal is reconciliation. In the end, the goal is to turn the quote unquote enemy into a friend. And that is the finish line, not just winning. And if more of us had that kind of a mindset of the goal is to reconcile and to heal, not just to win, then we could help to bring forth that world that size with love. And that's incumbent upon all of us who care about this work and who care about the world in which we live. And so I'm so grateful for the course that it gives us these tools to use to bring about this change that we seek. And I guess we'll just have to leave it there. But to recap the points, don't look out in the world and see enemies. Love those who disagree with you. Don't disengage from the process, because what you do matters. Vote. And understand that at the end of the day, we have a spiritual protection where we really are under the laws of God, and we can take great comfort in that. So I hope that you found value out of this conversation. Robert, is there anything that you want to say before we close?
Yes, what I would say is when you talk about reconciling rather than winning, which is great language, I think we may imagine, marches and fire hoses and all kinds of public collective activities, but we face this issue with our family members. We face it with our friends, with our next door neighbors. We can do that on the small scale where it is directly facing us.
Yeah. And so if you're looking around saying, what is mine to do? That's it. Love the one you're with. Thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.